On the moonless night of January 13, 1942, Lieutenant Reinhard Hardegen stood in the conning tower of U-123, his eyes adjusting to the darkness as the Atlantic wind whipped across his face. Through his Zeiss binoculars, he could see something that no German submarine commander had witnessed since the previous century. The glittering lights of the American coastline, stretching from horizon to horizon like a jeweled necklace laid carelessly across the darkness. The glow of New York City illuminated the low clouds to the north, while to the west, barely 6 miles distant, automobile headlights traced bright lines along the coastal highways. The smell of pine forests drifted across the water, mingling with the salt spray. Hardegen lowered his binoculars and turned to his watch officer with a grim smile. "It's like Coney Island," he said quietly. "They've left the lights on for us." What he could not have known in that moment was that he was about to unleash a campaign of destruction so devastating that historians would later call it America's second Pearl Harbor. A catastrophe that would claim more than 600 Allied ships and 3 million tons of cargo while costing Germany only 22 U-boats. The story of what the German submariners would gleefully name the Second Happy Time, or Zweit Glückliche Zeit, begins not in the cold waters off the American coast, but in the calculated mind of Vice Admiral Karl Dönitz. A veteran U-boat commander from the First World War, Dönitz had spent his career studying submarine warfare with single-minded intensity. Captured by the British in 1918, he used his months as a prisoner to analyze every tactical decision, every missed opportunity. When he rose through the ranks of the reborn Kriegsmarine, he brought with him an almost fanatical belief in the submarine as a weapon of economic warfare. He was a harsh disciplinarian, demanding absolute loyalty and peak performance, but he was also fiercely protective of his men, fighting constantly with the German high command for more resources. Dönitz understood that modern warfare was as much about economics as battleships. A nation could field the most powerful army in the world, but if it could not feed its population or fuel its factories, it would inevitably collapse. The Atlantic was not merely a battlefield. It was a vital artery, and the merchant ships that crossed it were the lifeblood of the Allied war effort. This philosophy had already been tested during the First Happy Time, that golden period from June to October 1940 when Germany's U-boats had torn through British shipping lanes with devastating efficiency. In those months, German submarines sank over 270 ships while losing only 6 U-boats. British defenses had been woefully unprepared. Their radar was primitive, their sonar unreliable, and their convoy strategies poorly coordinated. But the British had learned, painfully and at tremendous cost. By late 1940, they had implemented comprehensive convoy systems, improved their anti-submarine warfare techniques, and most critically, broken many of the German naval codes. The Atlantic became more dangerous for U-boats, and the kill ratios began to shift. The happy time had ended, replaced by a grinding war of attrition. Then, on December 7, 1941, everything changed. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war, and just 4 days later, Germany declared war on America. For Dönitz, this was not disaster. It was an opportunity of staggering proportions. Within hours of Germany's declaration, Dönitz was studying maps of the American eastern seaboard. He had been preparing for this possibility for months, analyzing shipping patterns, identifying vulnerabilities. Now, with Hitler's authorization to begin unrestricted submarine warfare against American targets, Dönitz moved quickly to implement Unternehmen Paukenschlag, Operation Drumbeat. The strategic logic was elegant. American merchant shipping was concentrated along the eastern seaboard, moving in predictable patterns between major ports. These ships carried oil from Texas refineries, raw materials from South America, manufactured goods destined for Britain. They were large, slow, and, Dönitz's intelligence suggested, almost completely unprotected. American naval forces were concentrated in the Pacific, and the few destroyers available for Atlantic patrol were scattered and inexperienced. Best of all, the Americans had not yet implemented convoy systems or blackout procedures. It was, Dönitz believed, a chance to recreate the first happy time on an even grander scale. There were, however, significant constraints. Germany did not possess vast numbers of U-boats in early 1942. The entire operational fleet numbered only about 57 submarines, of which perhaps 46 were actually ready for combat. Many boats were undergoing repairs or breaking down due to mechanical stress. Germany's submarine production, hampered by competing priorities and Hitler's initial focus on surface vessels, had not kept pace with losses. Furthermore, only the Type 9 U-boats possessed the range to reach American waters and return safely. This meant that for the initial phase of Paukenschlag, Dönitz could deploy only 5 submarines, a force that seemed laughably inadequate, yet would prove devastatingly effective. The selection of commanders was critical, and Dönitz chose carefully. Lieutenant Reinhard Hardegen, commanding U-123, was among the most capable. At 38, Hardegen was older than many U-boat commanders, a fact explained by his unusual path. Originally a naval aviator, he had been in a seaplane accident in 1936 that left him with severe facial injuries. Doctors told him his flying career was over, but Hardegen refused to accept limitations. He transferred to submarines, underwent grueling training, and proved so capable that by 1940 he had his own command. His crew worshipped him, not because he was lenient, but because he was supremely competent and possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger. The other commanders selected for the first wave included Heinrich Bleichrodt, Richard Zapp, Ernst Kals, and Ulrich Folkers. Each brought his own tactical style, but all shared Dönitz's ruthless focus on results. On December 18, 1941, Hardegen took U-123 out of Lorient. The voyage across the Atlantic would take approximately 2 weeks, fraught with danger from British patrols and the constant risk of mechanical failure. U-boats were cramped, fetid environments that tested human endurance. 50 men lived in a space barely larger than a city bus, sharing bunks in rotation, breathing air thick with diesel fumes and body odor. Fresh water was rationed. Fresh food lasted only days. The constant motion meant even experienced sailors struggled with seasickness, and the psychological toll of knowing that a single depth charge could send the boat to the bottom created tension that never dissipated. Yet there was also strange camaraderie, a bond forged by shared danger. Every man knew his survival depended on his crewmates' competence and courage. As U-123 crossed the Atlantic, Hardegen studied intelligence reports and charts, planning his operational area. Dönitz had assigned each of the 5 boats a specific patrol zone. Hardegen's area included the approaches to New York Harbor, some of the most lucrative hunting grounds imaginable. On January 11, 1942, 2 days before the planned commencement of attacks, lookouts spotted a large passenger liner blazing with lights, the Cyclops, a British troopship. Hardegen could hardly believe the ship's stupidity. Running fully lit, maintaining steady course at moderate speed, the Cyclops presented an ideal target. He fired 2 torpedoes. Both missed. Hardegen cursed the unreliable German torpedoes, a problem that had plagued the U-boat service since the war began. The magnetic detonators frequently malfunctioned, either exploding prematurely or failing to detonate. He had wasted 2 torpedoes on a target that should have been impossible to miss. But there was no time to dwell on failure. As U-123 moved south along the coast, Hardegen and his crew were astonished by what they saw. The entire eastern seaboard was illuminated as if for peacetime celebration. Cities blazed with light, their skylines clearly visible from miles offshore. Navigation buoys and lighthouses continued operating. Most incredibly, merchant ships sailed independently without escorts, without even zigzagging. Coastal blackouts, implemented immediately in Britain after war began, were nowhere in evidence. Later, Hardegen's war diary captured the German submariners' astonishment. "It's unbelievable. They're sailing with all lights burning, right along the coast. It's like peacetime." Lookouts reported seeing automobiles on coastal roads, their headlights clearly visible. The smell of land, pine trees, fresh-cut lumber, cooking, drifted across the water. For men at sea for weeks, it was a sensory shock, but also a tactical gift of immeasurable value. The reason for American complacency was complex, rooted in institutional arrogance, inter-service rivalry, political considerations, and simple unpreparedness. The United States Navy had virtually no experience with modern anti-submarine warfare. American naval doctrine focused almost entirely on carrier and battleship operations in the Pacific. The Atlantic was viewed as a British responsibility, and the few American destroyers assigned to Atlantic patrols were inexperienced and poorly trained. When the British offered to share their hard-won expertise, convoy systems, blackout procedures, coordination between air and naval patrols, their advice was politely received and then largely ignored. American commanders believed they could develop their own approaches without copying British methods. This institutional pride would cost thousands of lives. Political considerations also played a role. Coastal blackouts were economically disruptive and politically unpopular. Business owners complained that darkened storefronts would devastate commerce. Coastal resort towns worried blackouts would destroy tourism. Even within the military, some analysts argued that Germany lacked the submarine fleet to conduct sustained operations off the American coast. The result was bureaucratic paralysis, a failure to act decisively when action was most needed. On January 13, 1942, at approximately 9 p.m., Hardegen gave the order to attack. His target was the Nornis, a Panamanian-flagged tanker carrying 12,000 tons of fuel oil. The ship was silhouetted perfectly against the lit-up background of Long Island. At a range just under 1,000 yards, Hardegen ordered a single torpedo fired. The weapon ran true, slamming into the Nornis amidships with a tremendous explosion that sent flames hundreds of feet into the air. The oil cargo ignited immediately, turning the tanker into a floating inferno. Men leaped from the burning deck into freezing January waters. Some crew managed to launch lifeboats, but many did not. The Nornis burned for hours before slipping beneath the waves. Of 40 men aboard, 19 died. Paukenschlag had begun, and with that first torpedo, the second happy time was underway. Over the next 4 days, Hardegen conducted a masterclass in submarine warfare. On January 14th, he intercepted the British tanker Coimbra off New York, sinking her with 2 torpedoes and killing 36 crew. The burning wreckage drifted close enough that Long Island residents could see flames and hear explosions. On January 15th, Hardegen moved south, finding the Norvanna, a Norwegian tanker, and sending her to the bottom. On January 19th, prowling off Cape Hatteras, he encountered a concentration of merchant traffic. In rapid succession, he torpedoed the city of Atlanta, Siltvera, and Malay, sinking 3 ships in a single night. Each attack followed the same pattern. Position the submarine between target and shore, using coastal lights to silhouette the victim, calculate firing solution, fire torpedoes, watch results. If the ship didn't sink immediately, Hardegen would surface and finish it with deck gun fire, conserving torpedoes for more valuable targets. The efficiency was brutal, the results devastating. While Hardegen conducted his Rampage, the other 4 U-boats experienced similar success. Richard Zapp in U-66 sank 5 ships totaling over 30,000 tons, including the tanker Alan Jackson off Cape Hatteras, which burned so fiercely that the glow was visible from shore, causing alarmed citizens to call authorities reporting what they thought might be a German invasion. Ernst Kals in U-130 claimed 8 ships, demonstrating particular audacity by conducting daylight attacks within sight of the Virginia coast. By the end of January, these 5 submarines had sunk 25 Allied ships totaling more than 150,000 tons, without losing a single U-boat or facing significant resistance. Dönitz, monitoring reports from his headquarters in occupied France, could hardly contain his satisfaction. The first happy time had been impressive. The second was proving even more spectacular. The American response can only be described as shambolic. The first official acknowledgement that German submarines were operating in American waters came not from military sources but from survivors' accounts and newspaper reports. The Navy initially attempted to suppress information, fearing public panic, but this became untenable as burning wrecks littered the coastline and survivors came ashore with harrowing tales. The press began demanding answers. Why were ships sailing unescorted? Why were coastal cities still fully lit? Why had the Navy not implemented convoy systems? Senior naval officers assured the public that measures were being taken, but in reality, there simply weren't enough warships to protect thousands of miles of coastline. Destroyers desperately needed for mid-Atlantic convoy escort duty could not be spared for coastal patrol. The few patrol craft available, Coast Guard cutters, converted yachts, civilian boats, were woefully inadequate, lacking proper sonar, depth charges and trained crews. The failure to implement coastal blackouts was particularly egregious. British liaison officers repeatedly urged their American counterparts to order immediate blackouts of coastal cities, recommendations that were documented but seemingly ignored. It was not until April 1942, 3 months after Paukenschlag began, that comprehensive blackout regulations were finally enforced along the eastern seaboard. In those 3 months, hundreds of merchant sailors died unnecessarily. In his post-war memoir, Hardegen recalled the early months of 1942 with something approaching nostalgia, describing how lookouts could use city lights to navigate, how targets appeared with perfect clarity against the illuminated background. It was a damning indictment of American preparedness, made more bitter by the fact that solutions were known, proven, and relatively simple to implement. As winter turned to spring, Dönitz expanded Paukenschlag, sending more U-boats in successive waves. The second wave in February included 7 submarines. The third wave in March brought 12. By April, German U-boats were operating not only along the East Coast but also in the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean, targeting oil tankers that supplied the majority of America's petroleum. The Type 9 boats could patrol for weeks, attacking targets of opportunity and moving to new hunting grounds before American forces could respond. Commanders learned to time attacks with the full moon, when additional light made targeting easier. They discovered that merchant ships, even when warned of submarine presence, often failed to take proper evasive action. American anti-submarine patrols, when they appeared, were often poorly coordinated and easy to evade. The human cost was staggering. Merchant sailors found themselves on the front lines of a war they were ill-equipped to fight. Unlike naval personnel, merchant crews had minimal training in combat procedures or survival at sea. Many ships lacked adequate lifeboats or survival equipment. When a torpedo struck a laden tanker, the resulting explosion and fire often killed crew instantly. Those who survived faced burning oil spreading across the water, turning the sea itself into an inferno. Men who reached lifeboats faced days or weeks adrift in the Atlantic, exposed to winter storms, with inadequate food and water. The survival rate was appalling. In some sinkings, no one survived. Ships simply disappeared, recorded as overdue and eventually listed as lost with all hands. The psychological impact on merchant crews was profound. Men who had signed up for what they thought would be relatively safe transportation work found themselves in constant danger. Some refused to sail. Others sailed because they had no choice, because their families depended on their income, because someone had to deliver the cargo that America and Britain needed to survive. For U-boat crews, the experience was different. They were inflicting devastating damage with minimal risk, racking up tonnage totals that would have seemed impossible in British waters. Hardegen, after completing his first Paukenschlag patrol and returning to Lorient, was personally decorated by Dönitz with the Knight's Cross. He had sunk 7 ships totaling nearly 47,000 tons in a single patrol, an achievement that placed him among the elite aces of the U-boat service. The propaganda value was not lost on the Nazi regime. The German public was treated to newsreels and radio broadcasts celebrating the U-boat heroes bringing the war to America's doorstep. Yet beneath the celebration, Dönitz remained frustrated. He knew the second happy time represented a temporary advantage that would inevitably disappear as the Americans adapted. He desperately needed hundreds of U-boats to sustain the campaign and truly threaten Allied supply lines, but Hitler remained focused on the Eastern Front, and production continued to lag. The turning point began in late spring and summer of 1942. American forces, stung by the scale of losses and embarrassed by their failure to protect their own coastline, finally began implementing measures that should have been in place from the beginning. Convoy systems were organized, with merchant ships sailing in groups protected by destroyer escorts. Coastal blackouts were enforced rigorously. Air patrols were increased and better coordinated with surface forces. Most critically, American shipyards began producing destroyer escorts and patrol craft specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. These vessels could be built quickly and in large numbers, allowing the Navy to establish persistent presence in threatened waters. The learning curve was steep and costly, but gradually the balance began to shift. Dönitz noted in his war diary that American defenses were becoming significantly more troublesome by July 1942, and he began withdrawing U-boats from American coastal waters. The statistics of the second happy time are almost incomprehensible in scope. Between January and August 1942, German U-boats sank 609 Allied ships in American waters, totaling approximately 3.1 million tons of shipping. The economic impact was severe. Oil shortages forced rationing programs, critical raw materials were delayed or lost, and the psychological effect of having enemy submarines operate with near-impunity miles from American beaches was profound. The cost to Germany was remarkably light, just 22 U-boats lost during this period, most to accidents or mechanical failures rather than American anti-submarine actions. This casualty exchange rate, roughly 27 Allied ships sunk for every U-boat lost, was unsustainable for the Allies and represented one of the most lopsided victories in naval warfare history. Yet the second happy time also contained the seeds of ultimate German defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic. The massive losses shocked the American establishment into action, galvanizing efforts that would eventually turn the Atlantic into a death trap for U-boats. The shipyards that seemed incapable of producing enough destroyers in early 1942 would, by 1943, be launching ships faster than Germany could build submarines to sink them. American industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, was overwhelming. For every ship U-boats sank, American yards launched 3 or 4 more. Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels built in weeks, began replacing losses faster than submarines could inflict them. Technological developments, improved sonar, radar-equipped patrol aircraft, escort carriers, steadily eroded U-boats' tactical advantages. Most critically, Allied codebreakers' success in reading German naval communications allowed convoy routes to be planned around known U-boat positions. Reinhard Hardegen completed 2 more patrols to American waters before being reassigned to training duties in 1943. He survived the war, living until 2018, long enough to be interviewed extensively about his wartime experiences. He remained unapologetic about his role, viewing himself as a professional naval officer who had done his duty. He expressed respect for the merchant sailors he had targeted, acknowledging their courage and the terrible circumstances of their deaths, but maintained that submarine warfare was a legitimate military strategy no different from aerial bombardment. Karl Dönitz, who briefly succeeded Hitler as Germany's head of state in the war's final days, was tried at Nuremberg for war crimes, including unrestricted submarine warfare. He served 10 years in prison, maintaining that his submarine campaign was no different from Allied strategic bombing or American submarine warfare against Japan. The second happy time stands as one of the most successful naval campaigns in military history, a period when a handful of submarines inflicted casualties far out of proportion to their numbers. It demonstrated the vulnerability of modern industrial nations to economic warfare, the critical importance of protecting supply lines, and the devastating effectiveness of submarine operations when conditions favored the attacker. It also revealed the dangers of complacency, institutional arrogance, and failure to learn from others' experiences, lessons American military planners have studied ever since. The merchant sailors who died in those waters, their ships torpedoed within sight of home, deserve to be remembered not as statistics but as individuals who paid with their lives for strategic and tactical failures not of their making. They were clerks and able seamen, radio operators and engineers, men who went to sea because it was their job, because someone had to do it. When the torpedoes came, they died as soldiers die, suddenly and often terribly, and their sacrifice was as real as any death in combat. The legacy extends far beyond immediate military history. It influenced post-war naval strategy, contributed to NATO's integrated anti-submarine warfare systems, and shaped American thinking about maritime commerce protection. The lessons learned about convoy systems, air-sea coordination, signals intelligence, specialized anti-submarine platforms, became foundational principles of modern naval warfare. When American submarines conducted their devastatingly effective campaign against Japanese merchant shipping in the Pacific, they were applying many of the same principles Dönitz U-boats had demonstrated in the Atlantic. As the last men who fought in the Battle of the Atlantic pass from living memory, the second happy time recedes from immediate experience into history, a story told in documents and interviews, photographs of burning ships, and fading memories of elderly men who remember standing on beaches watching the horizon glow orange with fires of torpedoed tankers. It was a moment when war came home to America in a way Pearl Harbor, distant and cinematically dramatic, had not. The submarines that prowled offshore were invisible, unknowable threats that struck without warning. The men who commanded them were not monsters but professional naval officers executing a carefully planned campaign with skill and ruthless efficiency. The destruction they inflicted was not random but calculated and strategic. Every ship sunk representing tons of cargo that would not reach Britain, barrels of oil that would not fuel Allied aircraft, raw materials that would not feed Allied factories. The lights along the American coast that so astonished Reinhard Hardegen in January 1942 were eventually extinguished. The navigational aids that had guided U-boats were darkened, and the merchant ships that had sailed alone were organized into protected convoys. The transformation was neither quick nor painless, but it was inexorable, driven by the industrial and organizational power of a nation that, once fully mobilized, could not be defeated by attrition, no matter how brilliantly executed. Yet in those 6 months when German submarines ruled American coastal waters, when the Kill Devil Hills of North Carolina earned the grim nickname Torpedo Junction, and when bodies of merchant sailors washed ashore on beaches from Maine to Florida, the second happy time represented a humiliation and tragedy that cut deep into American consciousness. It was a reminder that oceans were not moats, that distance alone provided no security, and that modern warfare could reach into the heart of even the most powerful nation with shocking suddenness and devastating effect. The story endures as a chapter in human conflict that we are compelled to read, understand, and remember, lest we forget what we are capable of when we embrace the terrible logic of total war.